As a millennial, I've always felt like I am caught between two disconnected worlds. I'm old enough to remember life before the internet, while also being more or less tech-savvy enough to survive the modern world easily enough, and not yet at least feel alienated by mainstream popular culture entirely, even if I don't particularly care for it. I've heard it said that most people stop listening to new music, or at least their tastes kind of settle in their early to mid-30s, which makes perfect sense to me. While I personally might have come to this position perhaps a little earlier than most, what's relevant is that I solidified my musical outlook, let's say, in the early internet era. I grew up listening to the radio, something which seems unthinkable now, but I really blossomed in the days of iPods and illegally torrenting gigabyte after gigabyte of MP3s. Like everyone else, I now stream music mostly, but I was late to the party, and fondly look back on those days of having a music collection, even if it was mostly poor quality MP3s. In all fairness, the modest vinyl collection behind me here doesn't really get the use that it deserves. And it's not like I would show my digital collection off to people or anything insane like that. But to me personally at the time, it felt like my music collection said something about who I was. So much so that I would delete albums that I didn't like as if that somehow mattered, just on the off chance someone might actually look at my digital collection and risk coming to the wrong conclusions about me, Mickey Beats. Obviously that is stupid, but it's no doubt a familiar feeling for anyone before that who maybe had a CD collection, or before that maybe had a tape collection, or before that indeed had a vinyl collection, all the way back to the days of the humble piano roll. So having mostly formulated my musical persona such that it is, in the days of having a music collection at all, has imbued me with some residual habits and behaviours that are out of step with the zeitgeist of today. And in my defense, I am at least partly self-aware in this way at least. So the example of an artist that best exemplifies this conflict within me is the mighty Led Zeppelin. Of course, I love Led Zeppelin for all the obvious reasons. Great, epic, soaring tunes, great sounding records, and a live act that not only puts almost everyone else in the game to shame, but they practically invented the 3-hour Smoke and Lasers live show single-handedly. But I have always been low-key ashamed to admit that I like this objectively excellent band. So why is that? That's because I, and pretty much everyone older than me, basically, came up in an era where your taste in music was a badge of honour, where your taste in music said everything about who you were as a person, that signalled what you were for and what you were against. That was also coded in the clothes that you wore, the company you kept, and the places you hung out. And historically, Led Zeppelin have always been a band for teenage boys, the normies and the jocks. Rolling Stone magazine at the time famously sneered at their bombast and lack of subtlety, and the critics more widely had them pegged, not unjustly, as derivative blues hacks with Tolkien-esque lyrics who effectively kick-started the sleazy cock rock movement that even to this day can really only be enjoyed ironically. And speaking of cock rock, Led Zeppelin's admittedly dodgy sexual politics was still getting called out as recently as the Me Too era, and rightly so. But the thing is, none of that in the cold light of day or the long reach of history actually detracts from the fact they were one of the greatest bands ever to exist. All of that other stuff, the critical opinion, the fashion, the politics, the whatever, falls away over time, and all that is left is what matters, and that is to say, the music is what is left. And Led Zeppelin's music is of course undeniable. And young people know this. Even people only a few years younger than myself have looked at me with complete puzzlement when I try to explain why Led Zeppelin is some kind of guilty pleasure for me, rather than just a pleasure. What has happened here is that I have inherited a snobbery which is totally pointless. And while Led Zeppelin are just a pertinent example as they relate to me, I'm sure most people watching this will remember a time, not even that long ago, when it was deeply unfashionable to express admiration for, say, Fleetwood Mac, the Bee Gees, or Wings, all groups who now thoroughly have the modern hipster seal of approval. In fact, I have come so far on this kind of thing myself that I am not ashamed to admit that I went to go and see ABBA Voyage here in London for my birthday a couple of years ago, and it was so good that I cried. The version of me from 15 years ago would have been sickened by the very thought of such a thing. I cried watching pre-rendered digital avatars of ABBA from the mid-70s because I could no longer pretend that their music was anything other than really, really amazing, and I broke down at that realization. And young people, for the most part, get this. They like music if it's good, not because it's necessarily cool, critically lauded, or even contemporary. And for all the terrible things that Spotify and the streaming era are responsible for, at the very least, it has helped bring about a culture that at least tries to appreciate music on its own merits, to a degree. Rick Beato might complain endlessly that modern pop is terrible and young people have no taste, and while I don't like modern pop very much either myself, I think this attitude towards music is snobby and elitist in a deeply unhelpful way. Not only do so many people fail to appreciate that the generation before theirs obviously thought their culture was garbage, they also forget that this genuinely open-minded approach to music consumption is what is keeping good music alive now, and therefore also keeping music-based content creators like me in business and whoever else. This attitude is, for example, why Kate Bush had a significant career resurgence when Running Up That Hill was used in the show Stranger Things, because a new generation of young people discovered her for the first time and didn't care that she was some kind of Tory-adjacent 80s throwback has-been or whatever the snobs might say. This is also why the modern music industry of today is made up of something like 70% just repackaging old music again and again, I might add. In fact, I'd go one further and also shout out the millennial propensity for re-evaluating the near indefensible. For those who don't know it, Joker Man is one of my favourite podcasts, which deliberately looks at an artist's career, be it Bob Dylan, Lou Reed, or even Billy Joel, with a particular eye or ear for unearthing the value in what the culture, rightly or wrongly, at the time might have considered to be a period best forgotten. Dylan's 80s Christian phase, for example. There is some great music in there if you just look for it. And when you think about it, almost every musician you know and love has released something embarrassing. Indeed, nearly everyone in classic rock had a bad patch in the 80s. McCartney, Dylan, Neil Young, whatever. I even remember when I was deep into my obsession with The Who, saying to my dad, how is it possible that one of the edgiest, rawest live bands in the world could also make something as shockingly bad as Tommy the movie? And he said quite rightly that after all, these people are not gods. They're just humans who got lucky and made mistakes like anyone else would. They themselves were just moving forwards as artists tend to do, for better or for worse. So again, to drive the point home, I do really appreciate that we live in a time where more and more music of the past is being re-evaluated positively, and that can only mean good things for all of us. And while snobbery against Led Zeppelin, as discussed, is just one example of the kind of snobbery anyone can have against a band or an artist, I probably couldn't think of many artists that bring out the snob more than the subject of this video, but perhaps from a totally different perspective. So by way of explaining that, which again, people who lived through the 70s will know, yet people my age and younger most likely do not know, is that punk as a genre at least superficially created a very clear dividing line that in effect caused people to pick sides. There were lots of bands on both sides of the Atlantic that rightly deserve credit for splitting the punk atom, as it were, but I've heard a good argument that the Velvet Underground, in a sense, birthed the idea of alternative music one way or another, a lineage very much responsible for punk later on. But it's important that I focus on what the Velvets symbolize here more than anything, because there's also a good argument that the Rolling Stones many years earlier were actually the first to embrace the darkness and make that their thing in opposition to the cheeriness of the Beatles or whatever. But let's pretend for argument's sake that the Velvets invented alternative music. And they did that not just by being musically primitive, which of course at the time was not a new thing or a new idea in any way, but instead they did it by making being cool their whole thing rather than being commercial. And the reason they were cool were not because they were primitive, but it was because they didn't care. It's a posture. It's an attitude. It's fashion. It's internally elitist, yes, but it rejects the mainstream. So that's why that particular tree branch went on to create punk, and the other is the one that started with late period Beatles, first becoming bluesy hard rock, like Led Zeppelin, and then becoming full-fat progressive rock. And something that defines progressive rock and infuriates its practitioners and devotees more than just about anything else is that whichever way you cut it, it is really uncool. These people look at punk and they say, why can these yobbos who can barely play their instruments be considered cooler than me when I can play anything in the world? Why am I not the cool one? Why don't all the girls like me? The answer is, of course, I should think, fairly self-evident. So those are the two broad camps. And while I despise political centrism, both as an ideology and an equivocating strategic position, I am ashamed to say I am a musical centrist, in that I love it all. I love the Velvets because they are cool and musically basic. I also love Genesis and King Crimson with all their polyrhythms and stupid fantasy lyrics. And as I say, while I still have inbuilt snobberies that I'm working to break free from, I think in a self-serving, midlife crisis approaching kind of way, I'd like to think that I have more in common with a lot of Gen Z types who appreciate music mostly at face value, regardless if it was considered cool by cool people when it was released. Or at least I'm striving towards the post-cool age, the era I firmly now believe we are in. Which is just as well, because yes, the band, perhaps more than any other I could name, are famously uncool. Noodly synths, capes, lofty mystical lyrics, seemingly about nothing, sidelong epics, and a singer that sounds like a medieval pixie of some kind. Just so you know where my limits are, I do find Rush unlistenable for the same reasons, and I often point to ELP as an example of progressive rock at its soulless, indulgent worst. But then again, I really like Jethro Tull as well, and they are somehow significantly less cool even than Yes on the prog rock scale. Nonetheless, Yes are probably my ultimate guilty pleasure, a band that I would never let my wife hear me listen to, for example, but one that I come back to, especially this album, again and again, because it's like a familiar warm hug, in a way not dissimilar to the Beatles, for me at least. And unlike most progressive and hard rock, they are not trying to sound edgy or scary or heavy in any way, even when they play hard-hitting and forcefully, as they often do. Instead, their sound is really optimistic and positive, with rainbow Beach Boys harmonies and an approach to classical music-influenced composition that challenges the listener, yet, at least up until a point in their career, is still extremely listenable above all else. Yes are actually really pop, in my view, almost as if by accident, and they couldn't be more hated by the kind of people who look to musicians as arbiters of cool. So when I became cool enough myself to realize that my beloved progressive rock wasn't cool, they were the last band I was going to name drop, even if I never really stopped loving them on the quiet. Maybe weirdly, maybe not so weirdly, in my early 20s I came to settle on punky, Nuggets-era garage rock as probably my single favorite genre of music of all time, after I had got the progressive rock bug out of my system in my late teens and early 20s. Like for most people, my love for progressive rock started with smoking weed and listening to Pink Floyd, and then with my own early bands, it became about overly complicated song structures with recurring motifs and shifting movements, as if anyone other than the people playing this music likes and cares for such things, at least since the 1970s. Prog is like jazz in this way. In fact, while it was only a couple of years, albeit crucial ones, in my life, the band I led at this time, who represented this formative time in my life as a music maker and performer, was really weird, and I'm surprised anyone ever gave us the time of day, considering how off the wall our music could often be. Then at the height of indie sleaze, of course, in the early 2000s. The Mars Volta have a lot to answer for, is what I'm saying. But as far as an album that represents both the beginning and perhaps even the end of my progressive rock obsession, it was always going to be close to the edge. People pretend that Fragile is anywhere near it, which of course it isn't. Nothing they ever did even came close in my opinion. 9 out of 10 progressive rock obsessives will not only tell you it's their best album, it's the best progressive rock album ever made. And that is totally and obviously the case once you've heard it a few times. A literally perfect album from one of the most ridiculous bands ever, who made so many embarrassing mistakes throughout their 50 years of existence, had so many band members, so many creative missteps, so much toxic personal interband politics. But despite all of that, when they got it right, they got it right. and you've got to hand it to them. Close to the Edge is the sweet spot before it got too clever, too indulgent, and too cringe. There's something inexplicably perfect about it coming out in 1972 as well, the tail end of a movement, almost like it's a kiss-off to the hippie idealism of the 60s, bucolic and earthy, as well as space-age and forward-looking. But just before these musical elitists got too big for their boots, and punk had to inevitably come along to knock them off their pedestal. Its 3 tracks contain just about every type of music there is, and while its lyrics are on the face of it mostly gibberish, as a musical statement this album is deeply profound, both in what it says about human creativity and the willingness of the record-buying public to go along with something this reaching and ambitious. And it's easy to forget, this made them superstars, at least for a time. It sold in the millions. How on earth did that happen? This is of course not the first copy of Close to the Edge I have owned. I initially picked it up in a charity shop for a couple of dollars when I was about 16, and it was that scratchy vinyl version that I first fell in love with. I remember wondering at the time how an album this mind-blowing would end up in a charity shop alongside all the usual worthless dreck. Either the kind of classical or easily listening music of the pre-rock generation, or the kind of semi-disposable pop that sold in such vast quantities in its heyday that copies of it were virtually worthless. And I realise now that I picked up Close to the Edge in this way because it is effectively of the latter category, which is to say, this insanely weird and wonderful 38 minutes of music, at least for a moment in 1972, made up such a significant part of the mainstream that someone might bother to buy it only to throw it out or donate it alongside a tattered copy of Tapestry or one of the many 70s albums from Elton John that nobody really remembers. So the question becomes, how and why did that come to be, and what is the appeal of this music? Let's find out. This video about Close to the Edge is not part of my main Forgotten or Lost Masterpieces series, so this will sit alongside my Rolling Stones and Kinks videos. And that is because, like those artists, Yes are hardly unknown, certainly among my audience here on YouTube, and I therefore don't feel a particularly strong need to give a detailed overview of their career, nor do I really want to. I mean, I'll mostly touch on their classic era, of course, which is to say their first 5 albums or so. And I think that's fair, as they have released, at time of recording, 23 studio albums, and I'm pretty sure there are members of Yes that haven't bothered to listen to every one of those. This is a lot of music, and in my humble opinion, just like the Rolling Stones and the Kinks, both bands that I also adore, on balance they probably put out more bad music than good over the years, which is not unusual for anyone who has had a career as long and successful as this, in all fairness. Nor is that to say either that the bad music they may have made has in any way tarnished the good music, in my opinion. I think I could even make the argument that this makes Yes's classic era even better at a push. But anyway, to get the basics out of the way, Yes were formed in London in 1968, initially made up of the band's 2 co-founders in vocalist John Anderson and bassist Chris Squire, who then recruited guitarist Peter Banks, organist Tony Kaye, and drummer Bill Bruford. So the first thing worth noting about Yes is that they were a typical London band, in that many of the group members then and over the years were of course from London, but many of them were not, and most notably John Anderson, the group's nominal leader and certainly the member whose vocal sound is most associated with Yes as a group, is from Accrington in Lancashire, the county immediately north of Merseyside where Liverpool is. I do think it's interesting in what that says about London as a music industry epicenter then and now, the kind of city that young and hungry musicians from every corner of England might move to in order to form a group and then take on the world. His northern accent and, of course, his high tenor singing voice is key to Yes's sound, and one of the many perhaps weird or at least unusual things that make them the unique band they are/were. But I'll get into their weirdness in a bit. But despite later on garnering a reputation for overly flowery, indulgent and oftentimes twee music, Yes, at the time of their first self-titled album, released by Atlantic Records in 1969, were really quite heavy and brash in their style. Original guitarist Peter Banks, in particular, was quite a high-energy performer, windmilling, jumping around and otherwise throwing shapes about the place, which at least in presentation put them initially more in league with other London bands such as The Who, The Move, and whatever else post-psych, post-mod hard rock was going at the time. This is in addition to a heavy rhythm section made so by the strident, pick-heavy bass tone of Chris Squire and Bill Bruford, who reportedly developed his iconic, high-pitched, hard-hitting snare drum crack as a means to be heard above Squire's aggressive John Entwistle-style bass playing. And stylistically, this for the most part suited their early material, which is really just heavy pop for the most part. They stretch out a bit on Byrds and Beatles covers and offer some decent group dynamics on ballads like Yesterday and Today and Sweetness. She brings the sunshine to a rainy afternoon. She puts the sweetness in, stirs it with a spoon. She watches for my moods, never brings me down. Puts the sweetness in all around. Clearly far from the kind of stuff they later became famous for, and interestingly, one of 2 Yes tunes featured in Buffalo 66, the iconic 1998 film by Vincent Gallo, who bizarrely is godfather to one of Chris Squire's children. I can't imagine what the connection is there. Anyway, their debut album is one of theirs that I've always really enjoyed, even if it's not taken particularly seriously by Yes heads. Clearly the sound of a band finding its feet. It's nonetheless good material, played and recorded well. And I've spoken on my episode about The Move, who recorded a lot of their early records also at London's Advision Studios, in relation to capturing a present and punchy drum sound, which in combination with Bruford's unique jazz rock style of playing, gives Yes a distinctive sound that runs through their first 5 albums up until his departure from the band and their decision to move on to using other studios. The only exception to that is their second album, Time and a Word, which is really just not very good, unfortunately. The tunes are fine, but most people agree it is ruined by the orchestral strings clumsily ladled across the whole thing that just kind of bury everything else. While you can't really blame them for trying out new things in pursuit of a distinct musical identity, I feel particularly bad for Peter Banks, who hated the strings on this record and got promptly kicked out of Yes for his trouble. The Yes album, released in 1971, was their first real classic album. They had finally struck upon their style, which in all fairness was a combination of just about all styles. It provided them with the kinds of iconic songs, Yours Is No Disgrace, Starship Trooper, and I've Seen All Good People, that would become synonymous with Yes, and tunes that I would assume they are still performing live to this day. Personally, I prefer live performances of this material, as I think, controversially, that the studio versions are a little bit on the dry side, a bit clinical. But more importantly, the Yes album signals Steve Howe's entry into the band, shortly followed by Rick Wakeman also, who replaced Tony Kaye that same year, solidifying the iconic Yes lineup that made them famous and crucially made them the kind of musical collective that could go on to make something as remarkable as Close to the Edge. So for starters, virtuosity is a big part of that. Steve Howe, who is the sole remaining member from this classic lineup, still playing with Yes as we speak, I might add, is probably the guitarist's guitarist. Rock, jazz, folk, country, flamenco, classical, speed metal, blues, whatever. And seemingly on just about any stringed instrument you could imagine too. There were even rumours in the 70s that Steve Howe had had surgery to remove the webbing between his fingers so that he could play even more dexterously. Crazy stuff. And then you have Rick Wakeman, who is of course the keyboardist's keyboardist as well. The kind of jobbing session man so completely unfazed by anything musically that he can play the most complex parts with each hand on a different instrument simultaneously, all while drunk as a skunk, wolfing down a curry between songs while wearing a sequined cape at the same time. A musical hard man is Rick, who I believe had his first heart attack around age 25. And despite him being synonymous with a lot of the silliness around Yes and progressive rock generally, I've always thought that in joining the band, he was conforming to their aesthetic rather than the other way around. After all, he was equally at home playing on Lou Reed and David Bowie records as a session man around this time. But what the addition of Howe and Wakeman meant, other than a lot of the Spinal Tap-esque hijinks that later came to define Yes as a band, was that they had graduated from being a very good garage rock band to a super professional progressive rock band for whom nothing was too complicated and challenging. almost in and of themselves inventing the genre of progressive rock solely by virtue of having such musically talented and adventurous players within the group. Counterintuitively, it's interesting to me that as the group's primary creative visionary, John Anderson was Yes's least formally trained musician, something I'm sure he would be happy to admit, followed by co-founder Chris Squire, obviously an amazing bass player, but one who by his own admission only came to be so by locking himself in a room for 6 months and woodshedding, as they call it. Then you have Bill Bruford, an astonishing drummer with his own sound, who obviously went on to bigger and better things beyond Yes eventually, but who sits over here in his own category reserved for poshos who play jazz. I mean, no shade on them. I know a few London poshos who play jazz, and it's definitely a type, even today. In fact, the only time I've ever seen a member of Yes perform in the flesh was when a posh jazz drummer friend of mine took me along to see Bill Bruford himself come out of retirement for a set a couple of years ago. But anyway, what I hinted at earlier was the sound made by this lineup, the sound that defines Yes and sets them well apart from just about everyone else in the game. As far as talking straight rock, The Who are similarly cited as a band who has switched roles, in that, aside from Roger Daltrey of course, John Entwistle plays bass frenetically like a lead guitarist would. Pete Townsend plays guitar in a blocky, foundational, rhythmic way like a drummer might do. And rather than lead or ground the band, Keith Moon just goes crazy on the top of that, which altogether why, at least in their original form, The Who sounds like The Who and no one else does. Yes are similar in this way, but rather than switching roles within the band, they are instead switching places sonically. Chris Squire's pick-heavy, overdriven bass sound has a cutting mid-range honk, much like a guitar does. Steve Howe mostly plays slightly muddy-sounding, hollow-body jazz guitars through small combo amplifiers, giving his sound a pinched, underwater quality. And Rick Wakeman kind of fills in the gaps with farty Moog synths, warm organ pads, and the toppy sharpness of the Mellotron. This is of course on top of Bill Bruford's jazz drumming in terms of inventiveness and capacity for complexity. But he had a hard funk style sound, especially on the snare, which is certainly unusual. And then finally you get John Anderson's high tenor voice, pitched at what you might normally consider a female range. Yes are a bizarre band in so many ways, and it's what makes them so good. Then finally, before I get back to the actual music, it's worth saying that before they indeed became virtually household names over the next few years and therefore able to afford a big entourage, I cannot imagine how difficult it must have been for the poor sod or sods whose job it was to mic and mix this band every night when they were still schlepping it up and down the M6 for months on end playing clubs. I've done a little bit of live mixing in my time, and I would mostly describe it as chemistry. You're often trying to control a lot of competing elements all at once by tweaking them very slightly, because taking too much of one instrument or frequency out of a live mix might cause another instrument or frequency to dominate. Or maybe at some point two mic leads were swapped around by accident or something, and what you thought was one singer's vocal mic is in fact another's, and the only way to figure that sort of thing out is through trial and error in real time. You're always troubleshooting, is what I'm saying. So when you consider that Steve Howe, in a single gig, might be moving constantly between different setups, acoustic, electric, pedal steel, electric sitar for God's sake. Then you've got Chris Squire sending his bass into 2 different amplifiers, plus bass synth pedals apparently that he also used. Then Rick Wakeman moving between up to 8 different keyboards all at once, a full drum kit, and at least 3 singers. I mean, it's just crazy, especially considering the relative primitivism and fragility of analog equipment in 1972. So it was with this lineup that Yes recorded and released Fragile, also in 1971, considered, somehow by many, to be their finest album. Now, it has its moments, but I do have to take issue with this view, not just because it just precedes their only true masterpiece in my opinion, but moreover because its flaws are just so very glaring to me. Clearly for reasons I'm not particularly aware of, Yes were really under the cosh in 1971 and were running short of studio material as a result, and it shows. Fragile, I hate to say it, is basically half an album at best. 5 of its 9 tracks are mere showcases for each member of the band, usually instrumental and usually half-baked, conceptually and in terms of execution. I quite enjoy Chris Squire's The Fish and John Anderson's pleasant if slightly hippie diversion in We Have Heaven. But I have no time for Wakeman or Bruford's pieces here. They just trip with laziness and self-indulgence. Steve Howe's Mood for a Day sounds exactly like what it is. That is to say, it's the kind of style exercise that someone like me learns for their Year 12 VCE music performance exam. I mean, this stuff is what people hate about progressive rock. Surely the part of their set where you go off for a piss and a pint. Anyway, that said, the ensemble pieces on Fragile are the reason people rate this album so highly, and rightly so. Of course, you've got their signature tune, Roundabout, probably everybody's introduction to Yes in all fairness, the compact charm of Long Distance Runaround, and the iconic Heart of the Sunrise. Now, Heart of the Sunrise is a big Yes tune. In all the ways the 3 tracks on Close to the Edge are not, and in my opinion, it's inferior. So much of its 11 minutes is just endless up and down riffing. Which is impressive to 16-year-old boys and nobody else. It's not bad by any means, it's just procedural, unnecessary and jarring when awkwardly stitched to an otherwise otherworldly ballad, featuring some beautiful guitar work from Steve Howe. Love comes to you and you follow, lose one out to the heart of the sunrise, sharp distance, how can the wind with its arms all around me? I really adore the slow parts of Heart of the Sunrise, but unfortunately now that I'm not 16 years old anymore, I no longer have the patience to sit through all the riffing just to get to the good bits. In fact, my favourite track on Fragile to this day is in fact South Side of the Sky, a lesser known Yes epic which is musically nothing more than pure, weird white boy funk. Move forward was my friend's only cry, in deeper to somewhere we could lie. So despite its flaws, Fragile is highly regarded and certainly an important record as it cemented Yes's formula for group-written songs, usually with a track written primarily by John Anderson and 1 or 2 other members of Yes with additional ideas thrown in by other band members. It was also their second album under the guidance of producer Eddie Offord and the first to feature artwork by Roger Dean, 2 collaborators who would become synonymous with Yes's classic era, who would indeed hugely inform their masterpiece, Close to the Edge. So the fact that progressive rock as a genre is so typically associated with those of us who are pale, stale and male does it a disservice in my view. I mean, I understand why that view has taken hold, as it is indeed very much a genre of music beloved by boomer dads, but its association with a kind of small c, maybe even big C, conservatism ignores the fact that it is by definition progressive. Not politically, of course, but in terms of it being a challenging, perhaps intellectually restless form of music, perhaps why it so often overlaps the section of the Venn diagram that also contains jazz fans. Obviously, lots of forms of music, including jazz, are challenging and restless, but are not necessarily progressive. So I think it might be useful to try a little harder at nailing down what makes progressive rock progressive. And maybe the way to start is to at least rule out what progressive rock is not. And what progressive rock definitely is not is a specific sound. Yes, for example, are bright, diatonic, major key for the most part, at least, and the combination of their vocal harmonies and ear for catchy melodies make them distinctively pop in terms of their sound. Their evil counterparts in King Crimson are in turn famously dark and brooding, with their sulphurous tritones and occasionally abstract, cold and impersonal songs. While Yes and King Crimson are both groups that have a lot of jazz and European classical lineage, Other groups like Jethro Tull come from a far bluesier place, and further still, while Led Zeppelin are not considered a progressive rock band, they are certainly a blues rock band that is very much progressive in nature. So prog goes in that direction too, is what I'm saying. I was kind of hoping to land on the idea that progressive music is structurally progressive, in that while it might have recurring themes and sections, including, of course, things like verses and choruses, it is nonetheless compositionally going somewhere over the course of a long, often complicated piece of music, rather than kind of returning home in a circular fashion as most pop songs tend to do. But then that doesn't really work either, because Pink Floyd, perhaps the quintessential progressive rock band, for the most part play really simple, if epic, songs, usually with only a few chords and usually with only a few distinct different sections in them. And then you have things like krautrock, often lumped in with prog, but that is clearly from a more avant-garde art rock lineage, where composition is often constructed after recording, often in the editing down of long, meandering jams. One thing that progressive rock is, as I recall my dad saying to me once, with more than a little concern in his voice, is very white. I don't think it should be, of course, but it is true. It's also quite sexless in its way, again if you don't count Led Zeppelin as prog, which most people don't. It's also quite middle class, in that you might not need to go to Oxbridge to enjoy it, but a good education, a musical education at least, would certainly help when it comes to performing it. And all those things taken together speak to perhaps a very classist English aesthetic, which helps to explain why there are so few American progressive rock bands, or were. So after all that, the only commonality between most progressive rock artists, as we understand them, is simply that their songs are always long. That's really about it. But it does make sense when you consider that the genre started out with bands just like Yes, taking Beatles songs and stretching them out for 10 minutes at a time. Complexity and virtuosity is only an optional extra that later became synonymous with the genre, but it certainly doesn't define it in my view. So with all that said, while I don't really think it's possible or even useful to define the genre rigidly, what I think we can do is look at the ways in which Yes's music in particular is progressive, which brings me back to structure again. There are of course only 3 tracks on Close to the Edge, naturally meaning there are indeed long tunes. But more importantly, they are structurally progressive in that no single chorus in the album's title track, for example, is presented in the same way. As a listener, you recognize a lyrical and melodic motif, but the second time you hear it, something around it might have changed. Maybe the underlying rhythm of the bass and drums have moved to half time compared to earlier. We've modulated up or down into another musical key entirely, or, and this is why you get freaks like Steve Howe and Rick Wakeman into your band, you change a single underlying note or something subtle like that to create a modal shift that creates a difficult to pinpoint change in the overall feel. While the album does not have, and frankly doesn't need, recurring musical themes across its 3 tracks, each track internally reinterprets familiar motifs again and again, in a way that takes you somewhere beyond where you were before. So much of this is baked into the fundamental composition of each track on Close to the Edge, of course, in the sense that I have no doubt that each one of these tracks was for the most part structurally fully formed before they were brought to the rest of the band. But their collective virtuosity, creativity, and willingness to experiment affords each member of the band the opportunity to put their stamp on the arrangement of the music specifically in a way that adds or contributes new musical ideas, as well as supports the basics of the songs as songs. It would be like if every member of the Beatles was Paul. Ideas on ideas on ideas. Not to say putting this all together was any kind of joyous creative exchange. Far from it. Bill Bruford has spoken at length as to how every second of music on Close to the Edge was endlessly debated, and I can see why he shortly left the band so that he could embrace a more improvisational approach to playing, as he might naturally do as a jazz-style drummer. Rick Wakeman has also said he thought that Yes were on the verge of breaking up altogether when he joined, only to realise subsequently that constantly arguing over every little detail was just how they worked, and always would. But thank God that they did, because there is not a single note on this album that is out of place. I understand that they would finesse and record each section of each track one at a time before moving on, which partly explains its flawlessness, itself quite a technical achievement for 1972, so all credit to Eddie Offord for steering the ship on that. And it also explains, on the title track specifically, why you can hear Bill Bruford's snare drum gradually lowering in pitch throughout the song with multiple takes, and no doubt endless stopping and starting to debate whether the start of the next bar is going to be on the and of one or whatever. I've spoken previously about what makes up a perfect album, and while in my opinion this is the only time Yes ever achieved total perfection on record, I really cannot stress enough exactly how perfect this 37 minutes and 51 seconds of music really is. And a big part of that is also how seamless its production is. And while the physical construction of its constituent parts in terms of tape edits in the analog age of 72 is a big factor, so much of this album's effortless flow comes again from its original composition, in a way that Yes never quite managed before or after this record, in my opinion. I mentioned that Heart of the Sunrise is, in my view, a track of theirs that suffers from the jarring effect of transitioning between different sections of a song in completely unrelated time signatures and tempos. And while you get some extremely contrasting passages across Close to the Edge, particularly the organ section in the title track and the big spacey parts of And You and I, essentially you wouldn't know. Such are the segues between them, so completely natural. I would point to Peter Gabriel era Genesis as perhaps the worst offender in progressive rock as far as awkward left turns in their music go, although they did, in all fairness, make eccentric about turns a deliberate part of their musical character as a band. Yes are an entirely different beast though, and as complex and ponderous as they could often be, especially after this record, what they have going for them on this, their magnum opus, is a pop sensibility that first and foremost makes them accessible in a way almost nobody else in progressive rock was or is. And despite them often leaning into alienating progressive rock tropes, such as having really long songs and an overbearing musical virtuosity at times, Yes stand alone in how essentially positive their stance is. I mean, it's in the name. Yes. As ultimately a product of the late 60s, Yes's whole vibe is idealistic, but not political. Optimistic, but never quite light. Heavy, perhaps, but never dark. And I say vibe because there is indeed a vagueness there. John Anderson's lyrics are made to be felt and not heard or read necessarily. And that perhaps provides a refreshing contrast to the complexity of the music on Close to the Edge. While each track has genuine literary inspirations, big picture, the lyrics broadly speak to themes of spiritual enlightenment and universalism, conveyed abstractly through a hell of a lot of natural world imagery, from the river, the edge of which we are close to the valleys, the endless seas, oceans, Mother Earth, younger moons, space, mountain summits, and for good measure, more rivers. Always with the river, this guy. And more than just a series of images, I admire John Anderson's lyrics here for what they are. While in the mid-70s British music magazines jokingly advertised a service for interpreting Anderson's lofty ramblings, in an impressionistic way, the lyrics fairly clearly speak to a sort of spiritual reaching, a new age philosophical ethos. A pleasingly vague mumbo-jumbo of words that sound nice, as well as conveying, well, a vibe. And as much as I admire the well-read and thoughtful literacy of Bob Dylan, or the tough street-level musings of, say, Lou Reed, poetry, this is not. These lyrics often, but not always, read funny when taken as text, but that was clearly never John Anderson's intention, outside of actually printing lyrics on the album sleeve. This is rock music, and much like with the Beatles' best and most universal work, the lyrics are merely a coat hanger for the music, a loose conceptual framework for all of these weird and wonderful sounds that we're hearing. You could go crazy trying to interpret every line on Close to the Edge, but you're better off doing the opposite. Smoking a fat one, leaning back and letting all this musical and lyrical content wash over you. And I, for one, as much as I do love good lyrics, am definitely the kind of listener who looks for literal meaning after I have absorbed the feeling of a piece of music. And once again, it is difficult to come away from Close to the Edge with anything other than an overwhelming feeling of positivity. This is of course also reflected in the arrangements, particularly in the vocals, which again speak to Yes's ultimate pop sensibility. Don't forget that the tuneful pop of Simon & Garfunkel was a formative influence on Yes in their early days, alongside the harmonies of the Beach Boys, the Beatles, and the Byrds, of course. So the vocals also give a flavour of rainbow, technicolor optimism that is key to this record's overall positive vibe. John Anderson's voice is not only higher than most male singers in the game, bassist Chris Squire, who is very much second in command vocally within the band, with Steve Howe a serviceable if distant third, also matches Anderson's highs and manages to very successfully ape his singing style and blend his own in flawlessly. Again, as I understand it, the three-part harmonies were an aspect of the band that was very deliberately worked on in their early days, often with fairly shaky results early on. But by Close to the Edge, they in fact rival the Beatles, if not the Beach Boys, in achieving a distinctive group sound that really lifts the music. Come to think of it, it's pretty incredible that pre-computers, backing tracks and auto-tune, Yes were so successful in more or less fully reproducing their albums in a live setting, in a way the Beatles only could have dreamed of in their late period. And while they obviously must have had to tour with a mountain of equipment, Yes really pulled out all the stops on Close to the Edge as far as featuring a range of instrumentation. Just about every kind of guitar or keyboard instrument you could possibly imagine, including church organs actually recorded in a medieval church. And every kind of sonic texture available to humanity in 1972, including field recordings of birdsong, running water and wind chimes. And to the album's broadly natural themes and aesthetic, for a big city London band working very much in the then modern world of cutting-edge music gear and international touring, etc., Yes are pretty damn good at putting over a natural, dynamic and oftentimes delicate charm at certain moments on this record. And again, so much of this is down to their high level of musicianship, especially Wakeman and Howe. To this day, Steve Howe is extremely exacting about what he plays and the sounds that he achieves, with a reverence for his instrument that you might typically associate with classical musicians. And to his credit, rather than there being millions of overdubs of acoustic and electric guitars all over Close to the Edge, it's still usually only one guitar you're hearing at any one time on Close to the Edge, selected especially for that passage of music or section of the song. On one hand, this meant that the band could quite convincingly, as I say, reproduce all of this live, while on the other, it meant that as well as performing with his electric guitar of choice, his stage setup would have to include at least one pedal steel, one or possibly more than one acoustic guitar, and an electric sitar set up on a stand in front of him so that he could switch instruments multiple times within a single song. It's a bit over the top, and beyond the distinctiveness of each individual within the context of Yes as quite an unconventional band, as I've mentioned, I can't really go on without at least commenting on how Yes's rhythm section sounds on this album. For one, Bill Bruford, by dint of coming from a jazz rather than classical musical discipline, naturally injects his playing with a lot of character in a way jazz players tend to do. And while with Yes, the need to conform to arrangements more rigidly than he might ordinarily have liked to do so drove him eventually out of the group, he makes a genuinely equal fifth contribution to Close to the Edge through his idiosyncratic playing, from the distinctive crack of his snare to his high-pitched tom fills and mastery of polyrhythms. And as I mentioned earlier, whoever or whatever was at Advision Studios was perfect at capturing his distinctive drum sound. It cuts perfectly through the mix and is extremely dry, which is to say there's little to no room ambience or reverb on the drums at all. And while the piccolo snare craze of the 1990s was probably the last time snare drums have ever sounded anywhere near as high-pitched as Bruford's is here, the dryness of his kit on this record gives it a high-gain, high-fidelity presence that is very much what modern producers strive for now. I've said it before and will say it again. Almost all modern drummers want to play like John Bonham, but producers almost never want to mix drums in that big ambient way that you get on Zeppelin records. So all credit to Eddie Offord for having to harness all of the chaos in the mix here. Let's not forget, 1972 was still very much the analog days where settings could not be saved and mixes needed to be effectively performed in real time, even if I suppose it would have been possible to do it in sections, which I assume is the case with the mix here. And on that note, a lot of albums, especially early 70s ones, are cited as ushering in the era of drum and bass heavy mixes. And overall, Yes's sound, for all its Technicolor rainbow glory, is underpinned by and built upon a fairly heavy and solid foundation in its rhythm section. There is an army of bass nerds out there who go on endlessly about Chris Squire's bass tone, and rightly so. Even if, as far as I'm aware, it's mostly down to him sending his signal off to an acoustic guitar amplifier to enhance the high frequencies and a conventional bass amplifier for the low. Not an insane setup by any means, but nonetheless unusual for its time and certainly a standout instrument on this album and key to Yes's overall sound generally. Like the similarly styled John Entwistle, Squire was famous for endlessly re-recording his parts, and like Paul McCartney, preferred to do so after everyone else had recorded theirs, in order to bring a thought-through cohesion to the music. Chris Squire, to his credit, was the glue that pulled together Yes as a group and as a sound. And as the single most constant member of the band over the years, it's fitting that Chris Squire's playing is key to their sonic signature and probably the standout instrument across the board on this, their most famous and widely revered album. Credited only to Anderson and Howe, while no doubt featuring contributions from all members of the band, the 18 minutes and 43 seconds of Close to the Edge provide the title track for the album, its spiritual heart, the longest song Yes had until then ever composed, and certainly, in my opinion, the single highest high point of their career creatively. Not to be reductive, as they made a lot of great music, as I say, but Close to the Edge is really in a league of its own. It's interesting to me that Anderson and Howe wrote most of the track when you consider the amount of talent in the group. John Anderson, perhaps naturally, because he was the band leader and lyricist and creative visionary, even if he was, perhaps, the least technically proficient member of the band. Secondly, Steve Howe, who, of course, is, like Wakeman, a musical freakazoid whose central role in developing this track causes me to rethink some of the pushback on his current leadership of Yes at the time of recording. I mean, to paraphrase Pete Townsend, Yes was always John Anderson's band, and less obsessive fans like me perhaps were led to believe that Chris Squire was always the group's number 2 guy, when, going off of this, Steve Howe has every right to that title in all fairness. In fact, it was Howe who suggested the refrain "Close to the Edge, down by the river," referencing Howe's home quite literally on the banks of the River Thames at the time. In a perhaps typical fashion, Anderson co-opted this as a metaphor for spiritual discovery, the idea of living on the cusp of realization, the river being the path that leads you to the ocean, or the divine. More broadly, Anderson was musically inspired by the dynamic movements of Sibelius's 5th, 6th, and 7th symphonies, and thematically, if perhaps not quite lyrically, Lord of the Rings, and especially Siddhartha by Hermann Hesse. While I can't claim to have read it myself, Siddhartha is about a young Hindu's journey to enlightenment, with a river as a recurring metaphor for the unity of life and the source of the protagonist's own awakening. The lyrics of Close to the Edge don't track with the novel in terms of any kind of narrative, which is just as well. Instead, while they are perhaps somewhat obscure and verbose, I find the lyrics pleasingly vague in a really good way, and certainly not forced like bad lyrics can often be, especially in progressive rock. Something I'll give John Anderson full credit for is that his lyrics fit the music perfectly, and even if I don't care to actively follow them while listening, I think that that's a valuable lyric writing skill in itself, and part of what makes this record a masterpiece. The lyrics wash over you more like a laundry list of lofty metaphors and elemental imagery, occasionally shifting from third to first person perspective in a way that is both detached and somehow, as if through Anderson's sheer earnestness, extremely personal at times. I mean, for all of its hippy-dippy, ethereal proggishness, the Beatles never really wrote a lyric this deep, did they? So ordinarily, on this channel I might talk a little bit about the music and a little bit about the lyrics, just to give an overall picture. Here we're dealing with an entirely different beast, and considering my previously stated view that Yes are a big picture progressive pop band first and foremost, I think there's a lot of value in looking at Close to the Edge from a structural perspective first and foremost. While I haven't until now felt any cause to actually map out the song, I have always thought that its genius is in its structure. How is it that they can make a single, near 20-minute piece of music so consistently through written, forward-moving, tonally dynamic, and perhaps more than anything, hooky and listenable as this? Here is how. Before I go through it all, it's worth saying that in this chart, each section is represented visually in a way that is roughly proportionate to the length of each section of the song, for what it's worth. So firstly, looking at it, you can see that the track is broken into 4 approximate movements down the left-hand side. For the most part, I don't find them particularly relevant as sections or movements, beyond the fact that the second section, Total Mass Retain, is the one that they chopped out and released as a single, being the only section that can truly stand on its own. And even then, not really. But that's by the by. There's quite a few overall impressions that I immediately take away from seeing Close to the Edge charted out in this way. And one of them is that firstly, if you are to take away the bookending and middle ambient sections of the song, the free jazz introduction and the choral and big organ sections in the middle, you are actually left with something relatively pop and conventional in terms of pop songwriting structure. Which is to say, in the core of the composition, you have repeating verses, choruses, instrumental solos, the usual stuff. In addition to each repetition of a verse and a chorus, they are never being played or arranged exactly the same way twice throughout the song, which is part of what makes it thoroughly progressive. It's also worth noting that there are roughly 2 styles of verse in Close to the Edge. The first listed here in light yellow, which most people would think of as the verse, and the second in light purple that goes through more drastic variations in the piece. You will note that while the first style of verse is the dominant one that also provides the musical backing for Rick Wakeman's ripping organ solo here, they also close out the composition by giving us a taste of the second style of verse just before the last chorus here, tying the song's seemingly disparate threads together one last time before the big finale. So taking it from the top, the first almost full minute is a slow fade-in of environment ambience, supposedly a combination of field recordings made by John Anderson. There's birdsong, there's wind chimes, there's running water, and surely some kind of synthesizer pad or two. The decision to kick off this musical adventure with something unmusical was inspired by the 1972 ambient album Sonic Seasonings by Wendy Carlos. She was the synth pioneer behind charity shop favourite Switched On Bach and the soundtracks for A Clockwork Orange, very much in the culture at the time as you might imagine, and later on soundtracks for The Shining and Tron. The atmospheric crescendo peaks with a sudden swirl as the band launches into what we might call a free jazz improvisational section. This was inspired by Yes sharing a bill at least once with the Mahavishnu Orchestra the previous year, and their brand of extremely proggy jazz really put a fire under Yes to prove themselves as instrumentalists, especially now with both Wakeman and Howe in the band. Of course, Yes were never the sort of band for group improv in reality. Therefore, this section is indeed tightly written, as you might imagine. It has to be, with its 3 carefully timed vocables interspersed over 2 minutes of Steve Howe giving us his best John McLaughlin impression. I mean, obviously I can't play like this, and frankly nobody could do it after drinking even 1 beer. Steve Howe, like his nemesis Robert Fripp, is taking guitar to the level of elite sport here. It is fiery and impressive, with Wakeman summoning an atonal wall of jangly sound underneath as Bruford and Squire gallop through a continuous cycle of the D harmonic minor scale and a series of changing rhythmic ideas and emphases. It comes to a close with and a big vocal chord here before we crash into the song's main theme in 6/8 timing in the key of D. You also get a minor version of it here as well. Wakeman's gliding organ fills out the sound nicely here, and with a couple of accented rhythms and a simple fill from Bruford, we're into the song's first verse at just under 4 minutes in. Okay, so the verse is centered around Steve Howe, who now finds himself on the electric sitar, playing something loosely akin to what I'm doing here in A minor. After 3 bars, Anderson's vocals begin, and to be honest, it is a little bit amusing to me that the very first lyrics are perhaps the daftest ones in the whole track. A season which could call you from the depths of your disgrace and rearrange your liver to the solid mental grace. Not that it's bad when taken in the wider context of the lyric, but verbiage like seasoned witch and rearrange your liver is just a little bit silly for your opening gambit, in my view. Nonetheless, he establishes a rhythmic and melodic scheme here that really propels the track forward. I've always liked John Anderson's simple melodicism, perhaps in contrast to the instrumental virtuosity within the band. And I've always thought his vocals are applied to their music in a sense, like an instrument rather than a deliverer of text per se. Reading along, I'm also struck by how naturally he makes the words fit, even in moments where he alters the rhythm of the syllables slightly to accommodate a phrase.
And assessing points to know we're leading every single one. A dewdrop can exalt us like the music of the sun. A dewdrop can exalt us like the...
It's very subtle, but bear in mind that Chris Squire is indeed singing every word along with Anderson here, pitched even higher. Not only is that quite a feat of memory in and of itself, Squire's playing quite a sophisticated bass line under this too, gluing the whole band together in this section. The verse is repeated twice with a 2-bar G minor rest between, something we hear later again and again in the song, and we drop into E minor for the first chorus.
Down at the edge, round by the corner, not right away, not right away.
And while this is indeed the song's chorus, we don't yet get the payoff of the I get up, I get down refrain just yet, which compositionally I think is a bit of a cock tease. And while until this point the sections of the song have been in different home keys as it were, from here we have our first proper key change going into F, introducing the song's second of 2 types or styles of verse and making it feel like a genuine step change. It's worth saying, of course, that it's a very progressive songwriting move after the first chorus to now introduce an entirely new section, something that is in a sense justified by the fact that we had 2 go-arounds of the earlier verse, and therefore as listeners we don't feel we need necessarily to return so soon to another verse like that one. Steve Howe's guitar solo here gives us time to adjust to the new feel and the new key, with a choppy second electric guitar underneath, and I like the simplicity of Wakeman's single note syncopated stabs here on the piano, here grounding the band. Ba-bum, 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 ba-bum. Similarly, listening to Bruford, the easiest way to comprehend his playing is just to follow the 1, 1, 1, 1, 1 of his hi-hat most of the time, rather than count where his kick and snare falls, such that it so frequently changes according to its own internal logic, matched by Squire. Now they're getting a bit clever here with the old rhythmic syncopation, but bear with me. And with a new type of verse, Anderson also introduces a new melody and rhythmic scheme here as well.
Cross the line around the changes of the summer, reaching out to call the color of the sky.
And at risk of labouring the point, there are so many little details thrown into the song too, such as where Howe answers Anderson's lyrics.
Getting over all the time I had to worry.
Such a masterful, thoughtful guitarist. So now going into the down at the edge, round by the corner chorus, we actually have the very first time that any section of the song has so far been repeated. And that's considering we're almost 6 minutes in. And this chorus is presented here entirely differently, not only without the band stopping and starting as before, but this time in D minor as opposed to the E minor of the first time around, made possible by the second style of verse being in F, making D minor F's relative minor key, if that makes sense. Forgive me for the nerdiness here, but as clever as all this is, the genuine genius of it is what happens next, starting with the orgasmic release of the I get up, I get down refrain. In the key of C, And note the similarity of this moment to a certain recurring motif on the Beatles' triumphant Abbey Road medley, something Elvis Costello also later leaned on with his track Party Girl. Sound familiar? The fact that this bit is in C and lands on the F.
Now that it's all over and done, now that you're fine, now that you're home.
This makes it all the more easier to move back into A minor for the next verse, which is the same key as it was the first time we heard it. Which is to say, for all the switching of home keys for each section of the track so far, including one significant key change that we already talked about, we are deliberately right back where we started in a sense, and the rise in intensity here is in the instrumental arrangements rather than any harmonic shift, or at least any permanent harmonic shift, which they are saving for later, bigger moments in the piece. And this verse is a masterclass in arranging. It's compositionally the same verse as we heard the very first time around 2 minutes ago, still based around Steve Howe's A minor electric sitar part, yet everything else around it has changed. Bruford and Squire are seemingly now playing in 4/4 time with syncopated accents, something emphasized very cleverly by what sounds like reverse mellotron swells from Wakeman and Anderson's vocal part already pounding a swung triplet rhythm over the top. It's math funk. The only thing I could think to compare it to is probably later period Sly and the Family Stone, around this same time in the 70s. And this leads us into the song's third chorus, the style of which I describe as the busy version of the chorus, which, like the preceding verse, is like taking all the elements of this section as you first heard them and running them through a blender or something. Again, we're back to the original chorus key of E minor, but those same chords are spread out before rather than during the deliberately rushed lyrics of the chorus, this time over an A chord.
Down at the edge, close by a river, close to the edge, round by a corner.
Considering how this is kind of a Frankenstein version of the song's chorus, it seems perfectly appropriate to me that they again tease us by skipping the I get up, I get down part again, transitioning into the key of G for a new iteration of the second style of the song's verse, modulating a full tone or full step higher than when we first heard it. And with this key change subtly suggesting progression and movement, the arrangement here is otherwise much like we heard it the first time around. And with the relative minor of G major being E minor, we are seamlessly able to move into the song's fourth chorus again in its original key. We also hear the key phrase total mass retained from Anderson, giving this movement of the track its title. And while this chorus is played much like the first and second time we hear it, we get some lovely halftime funk flams from Bruford accompanied by Steve Howe, and they somehow climb up to D this time for the I get up, I get down refrain. It's worth noting that each time we hear this refrain, it's pitched higher than previously, this time a tone higher or full step higher, and in the song's finale it's a tone and a half higher again, in F. A whole 9 minutes from now.
I get up, get down.
To bring the second of Close to the Edge's 4 movements to a close, and with it a major change of pace, the decision to make the final chord of the refrain, ordinarily a major 7th, this time a dominant 7th, somehow allows a transition into the next more delicate syncopated section, led by a riff played in unison by Howe and Squire, while Wakeman cleverly invokes the Close to the Edge theme over the top, first heard a whole 5 minutes ago in the background on the organ. I can't actually tell you what key this section is in, but nonetheless it was contributed by Steve Howe and was in fact a riff from one of his previous bands, Bodast, from a tune called Black Leather Gloves, first released in 1968. The section ends by crashing into an E chord, and we are finally given a respite from this rather tightly written and intense piece of music, so far. This next section of the song, taking up almost 4 minutes, is best spoken about more broadly as there is thankfully far less going on. Most people refer to it as the organ section or by its name, I Get Up, I Get Down. To relieve the tension already thoroughly built up in the track, we get a solid 80 seconds or so of pure ethereal ambience, mostly synth pads and the sound of dripping water, before Wakeman's delicate church organ is faded in.
In her white lace, you could clearly see the lady sadly looking.
And it's worth saying that despite Howe himself getting a lot of stick for his unremarkable voice, the sound of Howe and Squire together here is really heavenly and testament to their musicianship. They're clearly willing to do the work required to get just the right blend on this, and I love it. Howe brought the part to Anderson, who effectively improvised his overlapping main vocal, over which another I Get Up, I Get Down slots perfectly over the top. The choral-like layering of the three vocalists here as it builds up to the really big church organ part is beautiful, and as a spotlight for Anderson and the song's central I Get Up, I Get Down theme is incredibly moving to me, especially in his rather simplistic appeal to human emotion here, and the ebb of life and flow of the river as a metaphor for all existence or whatever. Including Wakeman's epic pipe organ part here itself was no mean feat. Firstly, as it was recorded on location at the medieval church in central London, St Giles without Cripplegate, within an iconic area known as the Barbican Estate. Apparently the real challenge here though was not so much its recording, but stitching it back exactly in the right place in the studio, as of course syncing tape machines accurately in those days was something of a technical nightmare. Regardless, it's a worthy centerpiece of the track. To really drive home the dynamics of the wider song, it does shrink back down to just John and the delicate organ again before going big yet again and shifting from a major key into a minor one. This section has been in E throughout, but it ends with a droning B note in the bass, which after a bit of spacey moog on top of the organ, sets us up to dive into the final movement of Close to the Edge, starting in F sharp. With 3 introductory notes from Wakeman, the band crashes back in with a somewhat demented reprise of the song's main theme, while the rhythm section frantically chugs underneath. I don't claim to actually understand harmonically how this is working, but supposedly the organ and guitar are playing the exact same thing but in totally different keys. Regardless, the effect is striking, like it's a kind of mashup of the free jazz part at the beginning of the song and the main theme sections. Then we go through a cycle of chords repeating this bridging section, which may sound familiar. First heard in chorus 3 in a totally different key. We are then taken into Wakeman's incredible organ solo, which occurs over a backing of the original first verse in A minor. I would not at all be surprised if Wakeman effectively improvised the whole bit. Such is his session man talent for pissing this kind of thing out of his ass. Squire and Bruford are no slouches here either, turning the beat around and switching in and out of 6 and 4 time signatures. Again with that same bridging riff repeating and finally taking us into the song's final verse, in the first verse style. The final iteration of the verse is far more piano-led than before, Wakeman basically doubling Howe's electric sitar. We get this verse twice through, including the 2 bars of the intermission in G minor again, this time with block vocals. The remaining minute or so of the song from here on out is really significant for several reasons. Firstly, before the last chorus we go into a short section of the second type of verse, unusual in itself as they have previously never appeared side by side until now in this composition. But more importantly, while, as I mentioned earlier, different parts of the song are in different keys, they are almost always in the same key when they repeat, until now. That's because we get the final and most significant and permanent key change right here with
Knowing all about the place
into B flat for this snippet of verse, itself in an entirely different key every time we've heard it in the song. But overall, this takes the remaining chorus and the song's refrain up to the song's highest emotional plateau and level of intensity. In fact, while writing this, I found myself listening to the last 90 seconds or so, marveling at the golden, triumphant energy that somehow imbues the finale, almost as if it's supernatural in some way. While I haven't seen or heard any evidence to confirm this, I do wonder if they are using the Beatles' famous technique of recording this section of the song in a different key, then speeding up the tape to match the intended key, usually creating a very slightly artificial, otherworldly effect with it. I can say that on live versions of this song, they do the finale a whole step down lower from the recorded version, as even John Anderson found it physically challenging to replicate the studio version on stage. And in all fairness, it's pretty intense. The way they build and release tension in the song's finale is absolutely stunning, and you can hear Bruford putting an extra oomph into his final crash, as if to say, "We did it." And with that, the single greatest 18 minutes and 43 seconds of progressive rock music ever made is over. And Yes and their magnum opus, Close to the Edge, exits this astral plane in the same twinkly environmental ambience with which it entered. Following something as epic as Close to the Edge has got to be a tough call, but flipping the record over for the first of 2 tracks on side 2, And You and I gives us a worthy and worthwhile change of feel, particularly in what at least appears to initially be an acoustic guitar-driven track. For all of Close to the Edge's expansive and earthly environmental ambience and so on, it actually features very few acoustic instruments, making And You and I comparatively lushly bucolic in comparison. Based on what was initially a short and simple composition by John Anderson under the working title The Protest Song, the finished track attributes a songwriting credit for every member of Yes except for Rick Wakeman, who himself was instrumental in transforming And You and I into its final expansive form. I mean, sure, at a paltry 10 minutes and 12 seconds, it's only slightly more than half the length of Close to the Edge, but let's try to remember that 10 minutes and 12 seconds by any other band on almost any other album would be considered extremely long. The lyric is as obscure as you might expect, but is loosely based on the idea of finding a spiritual soulmate to propagate the human race in some kind of distant future, supposedly inspired by the science fiction writings of Russian-born American author Isaac Asimov. It contains potshots at materialism and organized religion for good measure, and could be taken more broadly as a simple love song in its way. Certainly, its use of subject pronouns, you and I, gives it a personal flavour that in particular moments can be quite intimate and moving when taken with the music. Broken into 4 movements, much like its predecessor on the record, I'm going to resist charting out its structure as it is pleasingly far simpler and easier to understand compositionally. To put it as simply as possible, the first near 4 minutes are a perhaps conventional song in and of itself, by the name of The Chord of Life. The second movement, Eclipse, is a slowed down spacey sequence. The third is another self-contained song called The Preacher, The Teacher, much like the first section of the track. Then we get a reprise of the slowed down Eclipse part, plus an outro tag of about 40 seconds, which is called Apocalypse, being the song's 4th and final movement. So it begins in a pleasantly naturalistic fashion with the sound of Steve Howe preparing himself for a take, playing a series of seemingly random 12-string harmonics before we get the song's meterless and introspective introduction proper. And so on. Then with a ba-ba, unison rhythm, kick, drum and bass that repeats from here on, we go into the strummed verse in D major as originally written by John Anderson, who enters after a melodic synthesizer introduction from Wakeman with
A man conceived a moment, senses to the dream.
We get 2 verses through of this feel with gradually busier Leslie filtered electric guitar, and at around 2 minutes 50 we get the release of the full band launching into what I would simply call this part of the song's B section, both a key change from D into a stern B flat and a time signature change from 3/4 into 4/4.
Coins and crosses never know their fruitless worth. Chords are broken, locked inside the Mother Earth. They won't hide you, they won't sell you. Watching the world, watching all of the world, watching us go by.
some ghostly backing vocals again through a Leslie speaker, and while you can't really make out what the words are, they sound perfect under Anderson's lead melody. The section also features some fantastic slow motion funk from the rhythm section, all driven by the dominating honk of Chris Squire's bass, before we're seemingly back at another verse. While tonally, this next verse is similar to what we heard earlier, the chords and melody are distinctively different here, and we will be hearing this again later. In fact, it's quite short here and effectively acts as a coda, ending the first movement of And You and I, with a very suggestive G6-9 chord, and the words, "Call home." This takes us into an epic, spacey section called Eclipse that is built around Bruford's slow motion flams and cymbal crashes, accenting a Moog and Mellotron melody that Bruford himself also supposedly composed. After some soaring pedal steel and a Les lead solo from Steve Howe, John Anderson comes back again with an adapted version of the last verse we heard at the top, pitched far higher this time. The Moog takes over again with the section soaring higher still before coming to an end. We get a reprise of Steve Howe's acoustic introduction, seemingly bookending the entire composition. But rather than finish, of course, Howe then launches into a rather folksy guitar figure to kick off the third movement of the piece. The Preacher, the Teacher. It is in itself, in fact, an adaptation of the original verse, and John Anderson comes in accordingly before a transitional section ushers the band in. This next part, unique to the rest of the song, is probably my personal favourite section of And You and I, particularly the combination of the vocal melody and the circular chord structure underneath it. I can't sing it that high, can I? I listened hard but could not see life tempo change out and inside me. The preacher training all to lose his name. The teacher travels asking to be shown the same. It repeats itself, then repeats the refrain. We get a Moog synth solo and a group vocal section, leads us finally back into the slow motion Eclipse section of the song, renamed Apocalypse for the final movement. The track ends with 4 more lines of verse over a 12-string guitar figure. And You and I is clearly narrower in scope compared to Close to the Edge, and certainly more simplistic in having fewer melodic motifs that are often repeated. Its dramatic shifts in tone, however, are what makes its 10 minutes fly by, alongside prominently featuring Steve Howe's 12-string guitar. So the overall feel is quite different, even if the music on Close to the Edge as an album is becoming less complex as it goes on. Credited to Anderson, Howe and Wakeman, Siberian Khatru's typically broad, impressionistic lyric is supposedly about the unity of cultures around the world, exemplified in its chorus lyric, "Even Siberia goes through the motions." It's perhaps the least progressive track on Close to the Edge, which is to say it's the most straightforward. Not to say it's inferior in any way to the other 2 tracks on this thoroughly perfect album, however. It's by contrast certainly energetic and even breezy by comparison, perhaps which made it such an effective show opener on tour for years and years afterwards. Steve Howe's simple modal guitar riff centers the song in a hypnotic, calming way. But instead I find Chris Squire's bass line throughout the song extremely satisfying. And I say it's straightforward, but only by the standard set on the rest of the album. While the section I've just played you might call the track's main theme in B minor, the recurring verse and chorus are both in G, with a key change into A minor for what we might call the bridge. Pull down the window, hold out the morning that comes into view, river running right on over my head. And even then, if the key resets to G for repeat of the verse and chorus as it does, it is that part of the bridge that is then later used for a further key change. After which the conventional elements of the track structure are abandoned, at least for now. There's an electric sitar solo, a harpsichord solo, and a pedal steel solo before some fantastic ensemble playing somehow returns us to the song's intro, followed by a new section entirely seemingly built around some nifty bass guitar harmonics.
Go down the window.
Something like that. It returns to a verse back in its original key of G, then closes out the song with an extended coda that is a variation on the song's main theme of B minor to G, with single word group vocals and some dramatic mellotron from Wakeman. It is bookended by the main theme again, plus an interesting, stabby, accented rhythm breakdown part supposedly inspired by Stravinsky, and somewhat recalling the vocable breaks at the start of the album's title track. Finally, Steve Howe's solo in the outro was recorded deliberately without him being able to hear the 5/4 backing track, creating unexpected and abstract results, a technique Frank Zappa was also known for. Considering its clean tone on top of the otherwise frenetic playing of the band, it's a great showcase for Howe in that it eschews the distorted histrionics of your typical rock guitarist. In a live setting, he considers this as an ever-evolving improvisational part of the song that he has continued to experiment with over the years. Perhaps unusually, Siberian Khatru fades out on this guitar solo, and with it, the finest progressive rock album ever made. Close to the Edge was released in September 1972, 6 weeks into Yes's mammoth 9-month 97-show world tour, hitting a peak of number 3 on the US albums chart and number 4 in the UK. Its cover, designed by Roger Dean, was the first to feature the band's iconic logo, much like how the Rolling Stones' tongue logo was first used on Sticky Fingers. Similarly, in my opinion, their most iconic album. Bill Bruford had already left Yes for King Crimson after recording had wrapped in July of that year, to be replaced by Alan White, at the time most famous for playing on John Lennon's Imagine, who impressively joined Yes for what was then their single longest tour, yet only after a single rehearsal with the band. The tour spawned their first live album, Yessongs, in 1973, and a concert film of the same name released in 1975. Close to the Edge indeed cemented them as a global concern, but their iconic era was in a sense over with the loss of Bruford. Their sixth studio album, Tales from Topographic Oceans, released in late 1973, proves that success ruins everything, on account of it being an 80-minute long double album, which, while none of it is bad, very little of it is particularly good, in all fairness. Yes heads may bristle at that, but boring is the word I would use. Something you could never say about Close to the Edge, even for those people who don't like it. Rick Wakeman certainly agreed, leaving Yes to become something of a solo prog rock wizard for a time at least. He was replaced by Patrick Moraz for Relayer, something of an improvement and moving more in a jazz-oriented direction. They were, of course, still selling records by the ton at this time, and of course, around this time started making ponderous solo albums as well. Wakeman rejoined them for 1977's Going for the One, something of a return to form in a sense, containing their late period masterpiece, Awaken, although that's only if you consider late period 1/5 into what would eventually be a 5-decade career. And all kinds of mad shit happened from then on, and not just the advent of punk. Yes split up several times, got Trevor Horn from the Buggles in, then kicked him out again. They quite successfully went pop in 1983 with the album 90125 and the song Owner of a Lonely Heart, a record a lot of people rate, even if it soundtracks my nightmares. They even did one album, Union, where 2 completely different versions of Yes took turns doing songs. They made more albums, did more tours, with more lineups. It just goes on and on and on. As well as touring members, over the years there have been 20 different official members of the band, many of whom left Yes or were sacked only to return later. Of their classic Close to the Edge lineup, only Steve Howe remains an official member at time of recording, with Chris Squire passing away in 2015. John Anderson was forced to leave due to a health crisis in 2004 and due to bad blood between him and Howe, meaning that he has since not been reinvited back into Yes, which is bonkers. Yes most recently released their 23rd studio album, in 2023. And about all that stuff, I really don't care. Like The Who, the Beach Boys, or Metallica. Yes, are really a band that should have split up a long time ago to preserve their legacy, but I appreciate that when bands stay successful over such a sustained period, it is no longer really about the wishes of the band members and more about their wider families and their minor army of employees. Let's not forget, the Beatles only have their reputation because they had the decency to break up and leave the public wanting more. Had they stayed together, perhaps the quality might have dipped in the 70s. I mean, if not then it definitely would have in the 80s. Paul was bad enough that decade, but I really think Lennon would have been even worse. And had that happened, the Beatles would not be revered anywhere near like they are now. Same for Jimi Hendrix too, who was lucky enough, in a sense, to die. So with that in mind, you might indulge me in a little thought experiment, where Yes called it quits in 1973. Close to the Edge could have been a full stop on an incredible, if short, career, and were that the case, I think Close to the Edge would be held up alongside Abbey Road as some kind of pinnacle of human achievement, rather than just one of the early albums from a band who had all the silly capes, dry ice, and other Spinal Tap-esque affectations. But just because that didn't happen, shouldn't, in theory, take anything away from how good Close to the Edge really is. So return to the idea of enjoying music purely on its own merits. While it means we can celebrate good music regardless if it was contemporaneously considered cool or fashionable or whatever, it's particularly important to the idea of preserving and celebrating human achievement, however big and small. And I do mean that in the context of music, as Todd Rundgren puts it, as a service rather than a commodity or product. Interestingly, music is becoming a big button that we press and the emotional wallpaper at the periphery of your life changes. I have numerous friends who actively seek out wordless and sometimes featureless AI-generated music to play in the background during their working day. Sure, it's natural that people want something unobtrusive while they work, but I definitely see this as the beginning of the end and the changing of the role of music in our lives in the future. Even AI-generated music that deliberately replicates something retro is for the most part pretty convincing at this stage, and while people have said time and time again to me that music consumers will always value the human element of music, I can definitely imagine a world, one that in the scheme of things is really only a split second away, where you simply cannot tell the difference between procedurally generated music and music that has been written and recorded by human beings. And by that time, we'll then be having the same conversation about film or any other part of our life that could, in theory, be imitated and replicated by machines. If it can be, it will be. Let's face it. And while I'm not really looking forward to that time myself, I do believe it to be inevitable and therefore think we should be reflecting on what we have now and what is good about it. And Close to the Edge by Yes is just another of those excellent, unlikely things that a group of humans achieved. And while all culture is, by definition, fleeting and frivolous in its way, I don't think it's over the top whatsoever to suggest that this is about as good as it gets when it comes to creating something genuinely progressive, complex, and yet somehow extremely accessible all at the same time. While processing power could no doubt imitate something like it, there is no way anytime soon that it will be able to conjure up from scratch anything anywhere near as weird, wonderful, and overall human as this. So obviously, my long-term love for this album and my love of some, if not all, of Yes's work stirs up a conflict within me, as much as I am gradually letting go of that. I'm sure that few people who have watched or listened to this up until this point is that offended by Yes and the excessive proggishness that they may represent. But I'm sure that they know others who find their noodly synths, quasi-spiritual musings, or chipmunk-style voices aesthetically offensive. And that's fair enough. Not everyone has to love everything. I do genuinely think, however, if engaged with critically in good faith, that it's more or less impossible to come away thinking anything other than that Close to the Edge is an incredible piece of work. You don't have to like it to see it for what it is. And yet, I've never seriously considered it, weirdly, among my favourite albums, my personal top 10, even though it clearly is and clearly should be. It is flawless, and I feel that I am glimpsing a little bit of heaven every time I hear it. And my reluctance to accept that is partly because this record is so universally adored by prog fans, and as a deep down poptimist, I ultimately have to accept that some widely held opinions can simply be correct. But also perhaps because I've somehow felt that Yes and Close to the Edge didn't say enough about who I am, that it doesn't mark me out as different or special enough somehow, in the way that, say, being a fan of Scott Walker or the Velvet Underground does. And I realise now that that is a whole load of bullshit. I remember that as a child, maybe in early primary school, I became intensely obsessed with the Beatles. Every waking moment of my life for several years, I was thinking about them non-stop. And by virtue of having older, cooler sisters in my early teens, I had to drop all of that stuff and embrace actual young person music, then as it was in the late 90s. And in my naivety, it didn't occur to me that you could just have both in your life. So in my desperation to conform, ironically, because we're talking about the very heights of alternative music at the time, I went probably another whole decade before I allowed myself to come back around to enjoying the simple pop pleasure of the Beatles. And as much as their music is permanently tattooed into my soul, that's still, to my mind, a decade lost, in a way. And I realise now that I did the same with Yes, and any number of weird and not so weird avenues my musical tastes took me down over the course of my life. Nobody should even temper their enjoyment of something because of what other people might think. That's stupid. That's what stupid people do. And so I humbly declare that from this day forth, I will unashamedly embrace the things that I enjoy without fear or favour, just like the youngsters are doing today in the age of decontextualised, all-encompassing, instantaneous consumption. I admit that Close to the Edge has more than earned its rightful place among my favourite records, and any potential future Desert Island sojourns would be amiss without it. And not just because it is objectively perfect as far as anything really can be, but because, whether I like it or not, it does say something about who I am. It says that I am as adventurous as I am conservative. I am open-minded as I am rigid and set in my ways. I am as spiritual as I am material. Just as anyone else, I contain multitudes, and that realization brings me closer to true enlightenment. Close to the edge, indeed.